Since 2017, the story of Little Peep is a topic that's been heavily covered all over the internet, with countless YouTube videos and Reddit posts talking about his early life, his rise to fame, and most importantly, his unfortunate passing. With many people looking at him as a modern-day Kurt Cobain, being an artist that was heavily misunderstood during his life, but became even more beloved and influential after he passed away. He was also the first artist to really introduce the world to the whole effect of becoming a lot more popular after you die. I mean, don't get me wrong, all artists become more popular after they pass away, but Little Peep was mostly unknown during his life, but after his passing, he became a superstar. And with so many new eyes on both him and his music, it led a lot of people to start to speculate what could have led to this unfortunate passing. Maybe he had a scummy manager, maybe it was bad friends, or it could have been something even deeper. But luckily for fans, they wouldn't have to wait long to get all the answers that they were looking for, because in 2019, a documentary about Little Peep's life called Everybody's Everything ended up coming out, showing the world for the first time the entire life story of Little Peep, or at least that's what we thought it was. But in the following years, we'd quickly realize that this documentary was only made to try to take blame off of Peep's label, with the entire thing serving as one big hit piece on Peep's former collective known as Gothboy Clique, with them essentially blaming people like Mackin and Bexy for killing Peep. And for a couple years, that was basically the narrative online. Gothboy Clique was an evil collective that basically took Peep in because they wanted his money, and then they used him for his talent to get where they wanted to get, only to throw him away like a used bag after they had everything they wanted. However, in the following years after the documentary came out, there'd be a court case between Peep's mother and the label that managed him all through his life, with her effectively suing them for malpractice, bringing lots of new details to light, that they actually mismanaged him quite a bit on his final tour, they were supplying him with drugs, and many other dark secrets, which effectively changed the entire narrative online, with everybody now pointing the finger at First Access Entertainment, blaming them for Peep's passing, saying that they basically used them for everything that he was worth and then left him for dead. However, I believe that both of these narratives are kind of foolish, because when it comes to real life, things aren't so black and white. There's no evil entity that was trying to kill Peep throughout his life. The simple fact of the matter is, he had a terrible addiction and eventually that ended up catching up to him. However, I think there is still more to the story that has never been told before, because after talking to multiple people who knew Peep in real life, many of which weren't featured in the documentary, I feel like I was able to put together a more accurate account of what really went down during his very short career in life. And if there's one thing that I can praise the documentary for, it's the fact that the title Everybody's Everything seemed to be very accurate when it comes to what was going through Peep's head on his final days. So without further ado, I want to tell this story one final time, or at least one final time before another YouTuber makes a video on this topic, but at least for me, this is the final time, and this is the life of Little Peep. Gustav R. was born Halloween night 1996 in Allentown, Pennsylvania, to his father Carl R. and his mother Liza Womack, with him having one older brother who was named Oscar. Funnily enough, both him and Tekashi 69 were born in 1996 and they both have an older brother named Oscar. Maybe that's a coincidence or maybe it's a conspiracy. Chew on that one, Peep Reddit. I bet you never thought of that before. But anyways, the family wouldn't stay in Pennsylvania for very long, with them relocating to Long Island, New York when Peep was only 5 years old. And this is where the family would remain throughout the rest of Peep's life. And for a while, life was pretty simple for him. He had very loving grandparents. Both of his parents worked as school teachers, meaning that they brought a lot of money in and that he had a pretty nice house. It's basically the perfect childhood that most rappers could only dream of. But even early on, Peep's parents could tell that he was a little bit different, with the first sign being that he actually had quite an interest in doing ballet, eventually even joining a class for it. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with a guy doing ballet, but back in the early 2000s, it was definitely looked at as a more feminine hobby to have, and after Peep ended up getting teased by a couple other girls in his class, he ended up dropping out altogether. After that, Peep would then pick up the hobby of playing baseball, which his father definitely preferred, with him being heavily invested in all of his games, being the coach for him, and basically only showing interest in Peep when he was playing sports. And on top of that, with both of his parents being Harvard graduates, there definitely was a lot of pressure on both him and his brother to really excel in school, which Peep didn't really do. Now, there seems to be kind of a misconception about Peep that in his early life he was always a loner, he was always somebody who never really fit in, but that couldn't be farther from the truth when it comes to his early days, because all through middle school he definitely had friends. In fact, he ended up meeting two lifelong friends going by the name of Emma Harris and Brennan Savage, who would both become important later on in his story. And on top of those two, there's also a couple videos online where he can be seen rapping alongside a bunch of other kids in a car, so he at least had friends in middle school, and it even seems like he had friends in early high school.
With these niggas, but I'm killing the rest. I probably snap on a nigga like it's Mitchell and Ness.
And on top of that, he had a very diverse taste when it came to music. He would listen to bands like Crystal Castles, Nirvana, Avenged Sevenfold, as well as acts like Panic at the Disco, and even a couple rappers like Future and Chief Keef, who at this point could definitely be looked at as the father of the modern underground. It's either him or Lil B. I know some of you are going to say Young Lean, he came afterwards. Some of you guys are going to say Bones, he came afterwards. It's definitely either Lil B or Chief Keef. Fight it out in the comments below. And all these different unique styles of music would eventually influenced Peep to start making his own music around the age of 15, with him even reaching out to an underground producer at the time going by the name of Smoke-a-Sack and buying several different beats off of him. But unfortunately, that wasn't the only big event that took place during the age of 15, because one day when Peep's father was driving him to baseball practice, Peep would actually catch him cheating on his mother with another woman through the phone, although I'm not sure if you could even say that he really caught him, because his father definitely wasn't trying to hide anything. Apparently he must have thought so little of his own son that he could actively cheat right in front of him and he wouldn't even go tell his mother, but Peep would immediately run to her after the practice was over. And not only did he tell his mother about it, but as soon as she went to go confront him, Peep actually ended up confronting his own father and lambasting him for doing so. And of course, most couples aren't going to get through cheating, so it wasn't very long before his parents ended up getting divorced, which I know doesn't sound that bad in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I've talked about rappers before who didn't have a father whatsoever. I've talked about rappers who were raised by 15-year-old mothers. I've talked about rappers who didn't even have any parents, but you do got to keep in mind that when your parents get divorced at a very young age, you don't really know the difference and it doesn't affect you as much. But with Peep being at the prime age of 15, he wasn't young enough to not know what was going on, while also not being old enough to have his own life, being moved out and not really caring about it all too much. So he basically saw his entire life change overnight. I mean, overall, nobody really knows what the relationship that Peep and his father had with each other was. I mean, they talk a little bit about it in the documentary, with Peep not really having a whole lot to say about him in the grand scheme of things, as well as kind of looking at him as a loser. But no matter what way you feel about your father, it's got to be hard to see your parents break up no matter what. And after this point, his mother would start to see a pretty big change in Peep. He would start dressing different, a lot more flamboyantly. He would paint his nails, he started dyeing his hair different colors, and he even began to get tattoos at the age of 16. With him pulling the age-old trick at getting his mother's initials tattooed on his arm as his very first tattoo, meaning that she couldn't really be mad at him for it, but she definitely was. On top of that, by the time that Peep got to high school, he would start experimenting with weed as well as Xanax, which definitely couldn't be good for a growing brain. And on top of that, he started to really resent all of his classmates. I mean, he really hated the preppy kids, which is pretty much par for the course when it comes to most people in high school. I don't think anybody really likes the preppy kids. I mean, hell, I don't even know if the preppy kids like the preppy kids. But on top of that, he would notice that a lot of kids were also copying his style, which he definitely didn't like. He would dye his hair one color, he would see a bunch of kids also dye their hair the same color, which definitely pissed Peep off, leading him to not really want to be there because everybody was trying to steal his style while also making fun of him at the same time. And to make matters even worse, word would start to spread around the school that he was dabbling with drugs, leading many parents to no longer let their kids go hang out with Peep as they saw him as a bad influence. And all these factors combined would lead Peep to really hate high school, with him eventually full-on dropping out at the age of 17 to do online classes, which he never really ended up doing either. Apparently he only had to write about one essay a week, which his mother ended up doing half the time, although he would eventually return to high school in his senior year, with a couple of his favorite teachers helping him out to graduate, and because of that he actually would end up getting his diploma, although it is unknown if he ended up walking the stage at graduation or if he chose to not show up. Either way though, by the time that Peep was 17 years old, he was completely fed up with New York. He wanted to leave, he wanted to go to California in hopes of pursuing a musical career, and his best friend Brennan Savage would actually give him an opportunity to do so, as he had recently also graduated high school and had plans of going to California to pursue a college degree, and he decided to bring Peep along with him to go look at houses. They ended up going up there one weekend during the summer, taking Brennan's mom's car to go look at houses, and surprisingly they actually ended up finding one. According to Brennan, it was pretty far outside of the city, with it being in the Pasadena neighborhood. I mean, I've never been to LA myself, so I'm not really sure how accurate that is, but we gotta believe Brennan on this one. And it seems like the person who was renting this house had a lot of faith in these two because he would let them both sign their name on the lease when Brennan was only 18 years old and Peep was only 17. And shortly after that, the two of them would move in together in 2014, with Peep being able to convince his mother to let him go by saying that he was going to attend college, which she actually ended up following through with before he ended up dropping out after only 2 weeks and pursuing music full time. And in May of 2014, he ended up dropping his first track that we can still listen to nowadays. There might have been a couple songs before this point, but they're lost to history, unfortunately. At the time, he was going under the name Trap Goose, and he was primarily dropping all of his music on Bandcamp, with him dropping this track known as The Goat in May, before then dropping 2 more tracks known as Latitude and Down Down Down. Apparently, Latitude even had a music video that was shot at the Pasadena house, but for one reason or another, Brennan Savage never ended up putting it out, and apparently he has no plans to in the future. Which I kind of understand. It's probably pretty amateur, and he doesn't really want to put that out because he doesn't want to embarrass Pete, but at the same time, I think it'd be cool to see where he got his start. And it was also around this time that he ended up getting his first ever face tattoo, with him getting a broken heart on his cheek. And apparently he did this because he never wanted to work a real job, and if he wasn't able to do so, he'd be even more dedicated to his craft, which please God never do this. I mean, I know a lot of rappers say that they did it and it worked out for them, but think about how many rappers it didn't work out for. And unfortunately at the time, Peep was actually one of those rappers because he was really having a hard time mixing his vocals, leading to a lot of his tracks sounding pretty awful. And with his songs not being very good and not getting any attention, he wasn't able to make any money off of his music, and because he didn't have any extra money to use on food, he would go several days without eating. Which of course, when you got two guys stuck in a house together and nobody's really eating all that well, people are gonna get cranky, and before long, him and Brennan ended up getting into a big fight, which eventually led Peep to go back to New York as he no longer wanted to stay with him. Although, to be fair, it wasn't any sort of falling out. The two remained friends after that point. They still went on to make music together in the future. So for anybody claiming that Brennan is a bad friend because he kicked Peep out of the house, that's not what went down. They simply couldn't afford to eat, so Peep had to go back to New York. It's not that big of a deal. Although to Peep at the time, it probably felt like the end of the world. I mean, after all, he had gone out to LA to chase his dreams, but he wasn't able to make it, and now he was back in his hometown, which he hated, living in the same room that he grew up with his mother. And don't get me wrong, the dude definitely loved his mother, but you're not going to want to be living with her when you've already moved out and now you have to come back. It's embarrassing. He had the face tattoo, meaning that he wasn't able to get a job, and at this point, a lot of his friends had already moved away to college, so his isolation got a lot worse, which led him to spend most of his days playing RuneScape on his computer before then recording music at night. Apparently he did this because he was kind of embarrassed and wanted to wait until his mother was asleep so she wouldn't hear him performing, but apparently she would often stay awake at night listening to his music, and it was the only time during that period that she really felt connected to her son. And don't take that as me saying she's a bad mother in any way. I think any mother in that situation is going to worry about their son. I mean, after all, he barely made it through high school. He doesn't have any working experience. He's got all these tattoos and a dream of becoming a rapper. I mean, I know a lot of people look at their parents as not supporting their dream, but at that point, I don't think anybody would. But Peep was dedicated and he was willing to prove everybody wrong, with him immediately going back to dropping music, this time on Soundcloud instead of Bandcamp because it was really starting to pick up steam. At this point, he would start to discover acts like Team Sesh, Young Lean, Dylan Ross, as well as Young Bra, who he would eventually become close friends with later on in life. He was able to see all these young kids really making a go at being a professional rapper. They were doing it completely independently. They were filming all their own music videos. They were recording their own music. And most of all, they were doing it with their friends. And this would really inspire Peep to keep pushing because after all, throughout his entire life, he had always felt like he never really fit in. But after looking at these guys, he saw people that he could really relate to. And more than anything, he wanted to be part of that world. It wasn't really about making the money. It wasn't about being a rich rapper. He just wanted to be around fellow musicians who could actually understand what was going on inside of his head. So he immediately got to work. In November 2014, he ended up dropping his first ever EP, which doesn't really seem to have a name. Most fans seem to think that it was called Gengar because one of the tracks off of the project is called that, as well as the cover art being Gengar. But before long, he ended up deleting that, and it's still lost to history even now. It's also important to note that around this time, Peep wasn't making the music that we all know him for. He was making more straight up rap, with him trying to put together hardcore bars, talking about the street life, all of that type of stuff that people do early on in their career.
I ain't gonna hate you, my mama will. I ain't gonna hurt you, my partner will. Remember you rode it like Chevrolet.
But it wasn't long before he started to shift into a more melodic style. And thank God that he did, because if not, he might have ended up like Slim Jesus, and I don't think anybody wants to see that timeline. After he ended up taking down that project and all of his prior music, he would drop the name Trap Goose and instead decide to take on the name of Little Peep. With no real deep meaning behind it, it really came down to the fact that his mother would often call him Peep when he was younger, and basically every rapper that was blowing up during the SoundCloud era had to have Little in front of their name. So there you go, Little Peep. His girlfriend at the time, Emma Harris, would say that it sounded like Little Penis and that he shouldn't go with that name, but despite that, he decided to stick it out, and he ended up dropping his first ever track under the moniker, going by the name of Keep My Cool. And despite her making fun of her name, it seems like Emma actually was supportive of his rap career, because she ended up filming and editing an entire music video for that track that was later posted on his personal YouTube channel. And this is basically the only way that Emma was able to get Peep out of the house during 2015. She would ask him to go places and he would say no because he was embarrassed, with him often saying that he didn't want to go out because he was too dedicated to making music. But when she offered to film music videos for him, he had no other choice and he would actually go out and do things. After Keep My Cool, he would then drop another mixtape in April of 2015 going by the name of Canopy and featuring all of the beats that he had priorly bought from Smoke-A-Sack when he was 15 years old. It seems like he wasn't very proud of this project either, because he ended up deleting it only a couple weeks later, but when he dropped his next mixtape going by the name of Feels, it seemed like he had finally found himself. Listening to this project, you can definitely tell that he was starting to come into his own. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still pretty amateur, the mixing isn't really the best, but the sound is definitely starting to form. And this project also included a beat by Drip133, somebody who was part of Team Sesh, and apparently he didn't actually end up buying it straight from the producer. Drip simply posted it on YouTube, and well, Peep decided to use it. But besides that one beat, Peep was kind of a rare breed when it comes to early artists, because he wasn't taking a whole lot of beats off of YouTube, most likely down to the fact that they didn't sound how he wanted them to, and instead he would actually end up reaching out to producers through SoundCloud to make customs for him. And this is how he ended up meeting people like Omen13 and Cryptic, who would make a lot of his early tracks. In fact, him and Omen13 actually had an entire mixtape together called In the Bedroom I Confess, which many people think is his first ever mixtape, but Feels actually predates it by a couple months. And it seems like Peep was pretty proud of this Feels EP, because he actually ended up doing music videos for 2 of the tracks off of the project, with the title track Feels getting a music video. And after listening to this song, you can definitely tell that it was heavily inspired by Dylan Ross.
I just want you in my life so bad tonight, but you frozen my heart and got me warming up my liver.
As well as another track called Life also getting a music video, which if you don't know about this song, it would eventually get remixed into Life is Beautiful. And I know a lot of people are really against the remixes of Peep's music, with them wanting the original versions, but when it comes to these two, Life is Beautiful is leagues better than Life. I'm gonna keep it a buck with you, it's definitely not mixed all that well and the beat kind of sounds like shit.
At your grandfather's funeral, finding out eventually the feeling wasn't mutual.
But Feels is definitely still a banger to this day. I can almost recite it word for word, so it seems like Peep was actually able to make good music even this early on in his career. It was also around this time that he ended up reaching out to another artist that he was listening to going by the name of Bexy, but unfortunately he didn't end up responding to him. Or at least he wouldn't until Peep ended up putting out the track that would really start to gain him attention in the underground, going by the name of Star Shopping. Now the story behind the song is kind of funny. Apparently the producer actually ended up stealing a sample to make the beat, meaning that if Peep ever wanted to perform it live, he could technically be in trouble for copyright infringement. On top of that, he apparently wrote the lyrics in about 15 minutes and recorded the song in only 20. He also claims that he was on when he recorded this song.
I got some in my mom's bedroom.
But seeing as how he was still in his mom's house, that's probably not the case. I think she probably would have caught him. I think it's a lot more likely that he was on psychedelics when he recorded it, but whether he was or not, his mic actually ended up breaking halfway through recording. But despite all these hiccups, it's still one of the best songs ever recorded.
Know that I'm not really worth it. If you give me time, I could work on.
And it would immediately start to pick up steam on SoundCloud. At the time, Peep only had about 100 followers, but after he put out Star Shopping, it would really start to catch a wave, and everybody in his hometown would really start to notice what he was doing. It wasn't like he was going to become famous overnight, but it showed that he actually had potential to be a very talented artist. And after that, he would start to get reached out to by other people on SoundCloud, with him immediately getting reached out to by an artist named Boy Fruit, who had a collective called Heartbreak Club, which included members like Little Skill, So What I'm Dead, who was going by Derek Derek Dean at the time, It's Okay to Cry, Young Goth, and Jimmy V. There's not really a whole lot of information on this collective, as it mostly took place online with none of the members actually knowing each other in real life. Apparently at one point they were working on a group project, but for one reason or another it never ended up coming out, with the only songs that ever surfaced from the scrapped album being all of the Derek Dean and Lil Peep collaborations, which he ended up leaking around 2021 to 2022. And to be honest, I don't think we're really missing a whole lot here. None of these songs are all that good. I mean, Lil Peep sounds okay, but when it comes to the other people, yeah, they're not good. But besides becoming part of that group, he would also finally catch the attention of Bexy, who apparently had no idea that Peep was trying to reach him for all these months, but after he listened to Star Shopping, he immediately fell in love and would reach out to Peep to make music together. And it wasn't long after they started talking that they became very fast friends, with the two of them often playing RuneScape together, as the two of them were basically in the same situation, both being trapped in their room trying to make music and make it as a rapper. Apparently the reason that Bexy was trapped in his room is because he ended up dropping a cinder block on one of his coworkers' heads and then he got fired, but I digress. It was also around this time that Peep got reached out to by another artist going by the name of Craig Zen, who was part of a collective called SchemaPosse, which included members like Jay Green, Cold Blooded, and Ghostmane. And after the two of them went back and forth in DMs a little bit, Craig Zen would actually decide to show Star Shopping to Jay Green, who was the leader of SchemaPosse, and apparently he liked it so much that he would immediately ask Peep to join the group. So Peep was kind of in a weird spot where he was part of two collectives at the same time, although he would end up leaving Heartbreak Club not long after this, and honestly that was the right choice. SchemaPosse was a real collective that had real rappers in it, and Heartbreak Club was basically an internet group. I mean, no disrespect to anybody that was part of the collective, but it definitely was never going to go anywhere. And this would start the trend of Peep leaving one collective to join another one. Funnily enough, this would happen again when he joined Goth Boy Clique. Heartbreak Club was really mad that he left them to go to SchemaPosse, and then SchemaPosse would be really mad that he would leave them to go to Goth Boy Clique, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. And the final artist to reach out to Lil Peep during this period in 2015 went by the name of Adams, a rapper from Detroit who's better known nowadays as Death Plus, and the two of them ended up putting out a joint mixtape called Gardens. It's not really all that important in the grand scheme of things, but Death Plus is definitely very underrated, and I feel like he deserves a little bit of a spotlight. But all of these prior projects really pale in comparison to what I would describe as his first official mixtape, Lil Peep Part 1. Now don't get me wrong, if you're a big fan of Lil Peep, it's kind of fun to listen back to all of this old music that he made prior to Lil Peep Part 1. I mean, Feels is pretty good. It's kind of fun to listen to In the Bedroom I Confess to see where he came from, but Lil Peep Part 1 is really where he came into his own. If Star Shopping was the sample platter, this is the entire plate, with one of the tracks even being produced by Grief from Team Sesh, although I'm not sure if he actually ended up buying the beat for him or once again took it off of YouTube, and Ross Dillon even producing a track off of this project, which meant that Peep was finally able to start getting intertwined with some of the people that he had looked up to, which had to be a good feeling. On top of that, the project had a lot of references to Thrax House, the collective that Young Bro was part of at the time, with him often repping the merch, and eventually this collective would also form into Goth Boy Clique, which goes to show that Peep was actually a fan of the collective even before he ended up joining it. But it wouldn't be long before he started to gain his own clout and attention, because he ended up getting a music video on the Astari channel with his track Nothing to You, with the music video once again being shot and edited by Emma Harris. And while during 2015 the Astari channel wasn't as big as it would later become in 2017 and 2018, it definitely would get more eyes on him and his music, and he was really starting to build a fan base at this point. So of course he immediately got to work on making his next mixtape, which you would think would be Lil Peep Part 2, but there was never a Lil Peep Part 2. Instead he would call it Live Forever. He ended up working on this project from around October to December, but before he even got the chance to drop it, Boy Fruit would actually end up leaking mall music, which honestly in my opinion is terrible. It's definitely not a very flattering look for Peep, considering the fact that he just put out a very solid project with a lot of fan favorite tracks, only to have this dropped a month later. But despite that, it's out there, it's part of Peep's legacy, so if you want to take a listen to it you definitely can, but be warned, it's not all that good. After that, he would then drop his collaboration project with Bexy, which was a 4-track EP heavily inspired by RuneScape called Romeo's Regrets, with one of the tracks off of this project named pair actually getting a music video where Peep and Bexy would use green screens to try to appear like they were in the same room. After that, in December, he would finally drop Live Forever, which had a feature from Young Goth on the track Pick Me Up, which once again, Young Goth is not a very good rapper, but it goes to show that the two of them were becoming close friends at the time. On top of that, he would also get Little Skill to do production on his track Nuts, which nowadays is one of Peep's most popular tracks ever and is definitely a classic in his catalog. Although if you look at the track, you won't see the name Little Skill because he actually ended up changing his name to Rainy Bear. Apparently he did this because he ended up transitioning from a male to a female. At least that's what somebody told me in the comment section. I don't know if they're trolling me, but if he did, good for them. And this project would also land him another music video on the Astari channel with the title track Live Forever, once again shot by Emma. And surprisingly, even though there was only about 20 remaining days in 2015, he was able to put out one more mixtape going by the name of Vertigo, which was a collaboration with John Mello, one of his favorite producers at the time. It's also important to note that John Mello was primarily producing for Thraxhouse around this time, meaning that Peep was getting ever so closer to being intertwined with this collective that he had looked up to all through the years of 2014 and 2015. And once again, one of the tracks off of this project, going by the name of MOS or Moss, I'm not really sure how you say it, got a music video on Astari, which once again did numbers, which finally ended off the year 2015. And after looking at his output throughout the entire year, you can definitely tell that Peep really wanted this because he ended up putting out around 12 mixtapes, or about one project a month. And while some of the quality on a couple of these projects is definitely lacking, it showed that he was willing to put in consistent work day after day after day, recording music videos, recording tracks, and unlike a lot of artists, he didn't give up. And everything would really start to pay off in 2016, because if 2015 was his sophomore year in the rap game, 2016 is when he really started to break through. With the year immediately kicking off with a collaboration mixtape between all of the members of SchemaPosse, or rather the members that Jay Green wanted to focus attention on, which was basically only Lil Peep and Ghostmane, which of course would immediately start friction with many members of the group, as after all, a lot of these guys had already been here since early 2015, and Lil Peep had only joined a couple months ago and was already getting all of the shine and attention by Jay Green and the rest of the audience. It seems like Green really had a fascination with Lil Peep's singing, as well as him trying to turn Ghostmane from a funk artist to a fast rapper, and he thought that these were going to be his tickets out of the underground. However, immediately he would start to be shady with him not putting Lil Peep in the group chats alongside all of the other members of SchemaPosse, making him once again be isolated from all of the rest of the members, and once he finally got the chance to meet them, he didn't even know who a lot of them were. However, Peep wasn't really aware that any of this was going on at the time, so he would simply continue to drop music on Soundcloud and YouTube, with him putting out a music video for his track Drugs, which wasn't actually uploaded on the Astari channel, instead being put on a channel called Hunter XR, which I've never really heard of before, but it seemed like it was pretty popular during the time. After that, only a couple days later, he would drop yet another mixtape, this time being a collaboration project with the producer Ned Arb called California Girls, and this project included two of Peep's most popular and important songs, being Little Kennedy and even more importantly Beamer Boy. This track would immediately become a hit on SoundCloud, even surpassing Star Shopping, with Emma recording one final music video for Peep and uploading it later in the month. Although I don't want to oversell how popular the song is, I'm not sure exactly how many plays it had in early 2016, but Peep had around 6,000 followers at this point on SoundCloud, which wasn't bad for the time, but definitely wasn't big boy numbers by any means. You see, the rise of Lil Peep kind of happened bit by bit by bit. With most artists, they put out one song, it gains a little bit of popularity, and then they put out another one, maybe a mixtape, and then one of the songs really takes off and they blow up out of the underground. However, with Peep, it was kind of like he would get a minor hit and then he would get a slightly bigger hit. He would start to get attention within the local scene, but he didn't put out anything that really blew up and got on the radios. Well, at least not yet. And it seems like after the success of Beamer Boy, Peep finally had enough confidence and enough money to move out of his mother's house for the second time, with him immediately going down to Colorado to live with It's Okay to Cry and Young Goth. However, this definitely wasn't his permanent residency, as he would often bounce back and forth between Colorado and California, with him spending some of his time at the Pasadena house and getting to meet people like Omen 13 in real life for the first time, as well as Craig Zen. However, it wasn't long before Craig Zen started to despise Lil Peep, because apparently he wasn't very happy with him getting all of the shine and all the attention from Jay Green when he was was the one who brought him into SchemaPosse in the first place, so he ended up getting into a big fight with Green, and then eventually ended up leaving SchemaPosse to form his own group. This collective was known as Infinite Militia, and it was basically Craig, Zen, and Omen 13, although it never really went anywhere and it's not all that important in regards to this story. All you need to know is after this point, Craig Zen absolutely hated Little Peep. So really before Peep even got the chance to do anything whatsoever, he had already made an enemy, which couldn't have felt good considering he just got himself into this underground world, a world that he had wanted to be part of ever since he was 15 years old, and now things were all going wrong. However, Peep wouldn't let this stop him because in February 2016 he had a very busy month with Green, Ghost, and him dropping a follow-up project called Elemental, with one of the tracks off this project called Words You Hear on a Sinking Ship getting a music video on the SchemaPosse channel, which once again did numbers, although still in a kind of underground sense. He would also go on to play his first ever show in Tucson, Arizona, where he would show off his new pink hair as well as performing alongside SchemaPosse. And apparently Peep was so nervous before he performed that he actually ended up taking a couple of Xanax to try to steady his nerves, which definitely wasn't a very good habit, but it was one that he would keep throughout most of the rest of his career. And things definitely weren't any better at the Colorado headquarters. In fact, this is probably where Little Peep's drug addiction really kicked off. I mean, don't get me wrong, doing Xanax at the age of 15 is not good for any kid, but he might have been able to kick that. But once he got there, he really started to indulge in drugs. With him drinking lean for the first time, getting introduced to Oxycontin, but most importantly, which would become Little Peep's drug of choice all throughout the rest of his life. Xanax might have been the thing that finally took him out, but was definitely there throughout his entire life, and I would describe it as his primary addiction. I mean, Peep was the type of guy that would take any drug as long as it was put in front of him, but he really enjoyed cocaine. And it was also around this time that his relationship with Emma would come to an end, as after all, he was living in a house with a bunch of other SoundCloud artists, they were doing drugs every day, and that didn't really leave a whole lot of time for him to be able to connect to her. At one point she would apparently ask to come out and visit him, but he didn't want her to be part of the lifestyle that he was starting to get into, so the two of them decided to break up, which basically severed his final tie from his normal life in New York, with him now being fully indulged in this drugged out rapper lifestyle throughout the rest of his days. However, even with this relationship coming to an end, this was the point that Little Peep really started to pop off, because he ended up putting out a track called Come Around alongside a music video that was released on the No Jumper channel. And all of his music videos before this point had done pretty well, they probably got around 30,000 views, but this one really blew up, as after all, at this point in 2016, No Jumper was becoming a massive platform for underground hip-hop, and this music video would introduce Peep's music to an entirely new audience that he had never tapped into before. And on top of that, Jay Green would then drop his own music video on the No Jumper channel called Round Here, which also went on to do numbers, so at this point, SchemaPosse's name was definitely ringing in the streets. However, even with the group starting to pick up steam, it seems like Little Peep was already starting to kind of isolate himself away from them, with him choosing to spend most of his time with the Denver Co group, which was basically It's Okay to Cry, Jimmy V, and Young Goth. Him and It's Okay to Cry ended up putting out a joint EP called Dead Broke before Peep then got his first ever interview by Quiet Cam on the channel Underground Rising, which for some reason ended up getting deleted. Despite that though, it's been re-uploaded multiple times, and if you watch it, you really get a sense of what the lifestyle that Peep was living at the time was really like. Soon after that interview, Peep would then try to form his own group, which went by the name of Silver Fox Charm Babies, which once again was Young Goth, It's Okay to Cry, Jimmy V, and a producer named LaDerrick. This group was incredibly short-lived, with them only playing one real show in Denver, as well as creating the cover arts for a couple of Peep's tracks, including the Little Poop freestyle, so that's definitely pretty legendary, but the entire idea was thought up when they were on acid at an aquarium, so it definitely was doomed to fail right from the start. But despite that, Peep would start to spend more and more time with the Denver group, and really would start to miss a lot of his obligations with SchemaPosse, missing several shows in a row, including one in Portland, which actually had XXXTentacion and Ski Mask the Slump God as openers, which means if Jay Green was a slightly better manager, Little Peep might have actually met X all the way back in 2016, but unfortunately that never happened. But unfortunately for Peep, he wasn't able to stay in Denver for much longer, because it turns out that him and It's Okay to Cry really did not like each other. There's a couple different reasons behind this. Apparently one of them is that they got in a fight over the whole crybaby aesthetic. Apparently Peep thought that he came up with it, and It's Okay to Cry thought that he came up with it. Kind of a stupid argument, but the two of them were on drugs constantly, so it makes sense that they would fight over petty stuff. On top of that, apparently Peep wouldn't shower for multiple weeks at a time because, of course, he was too strung out, and Cry couldn't stand the smell anymore. And this would eventually come to a head when little Peep, Young Goth, and Laderick all decided to split in the middle of the night, taking a plane ticket back to California to live at the Pasadena house, which basically left It's Okay to Cry high and dry with no way to pay the rent, or at least that's what he claimed, but we later found out that It's Okay to Cry actually has very rich parents, so it probably wasn't all that big of a deal. Although it is kind of funny to picture the scenario where Goth, Peep, and Laderick all hopped on a plane and left It's Okay to Cry, only for him to wake up the next morning and be like, where is everybody? And then he ends up seeing Jimmy V on his couch with a bunch of shit in his pants, and he's like, come on, you couldn't have taken this guy too? And apparently around the same time that little Peep fell out with It's Okay to Cry, the Suicide Boys actually ended up falling out with SchemaPosse. They all ended up having a show together where this biker gang would show up that was called G9, and apparently they really didn't like the fact that the boys were using the same numbers as them for their own collective, even though it wasn't a biker gang, but they ended up showing up to this show and getting into a massive fight with the Suicide Boys. Apparently Puya ran out, Fat Nick ran out, and Germ ran out, and they all helped them fight, while people like Ghostman, Jay Green, and Black Smurf didn't go out to try to help them fight. And apparently after that, the boys were very upset that they didn't show them any loyalty, so they completely severed ties with SchemaPosse as well as Black Smurf and would only work with Buffet Boys from that moment on. So if you're wondering why the Suicide Boys don't fuck with Black Smurf anymore, that's the reason. And it was because of this event that the Suicide Boys would actually go to Little Peep and tell him that he should leave SchemaPosse, as well as telling Ghostman the same thing, although I don't think them and Ghostman were really cool at the time, but apparently they all had a joint enemy in Jay Green. However, Peep would stick it out with the group for a little bit longer, because once he ended up landing at the Pasadena house, he would record a track called Homecoming, which had features from people like Kill Station, Cold Blooded, and many, many more. And this was really the last hurrah of the SchemaPosse, because soon after that, they would go on to do a No Jumper interview where most of the members weren't even allowed to be on camera, and it was basically only Peep, Ghost, and Green once again. And to make matters even worse, Peep and Ghost didn't really even get the chance to talk because Jay Green was rambling the entire time. He also ended up making a homophobic comment, which really pissed off Peep, as well as talking about how Ghostman had anger issues and would often punch holes in the wall, so definitely not a good look overall. However, the last straw for Little Peep is when he ended up performing at Ham on Everything, and the SchemaPosse wasn't actually allowed to go up on stage with him, which made Jay Green so upset that he would immediately start yelling at Peep after the show, and Peep would immediately bite back by telling Green that he wasn't paying him properly, as he was basically getting screwed on every single show that they had done up to this point, but Green didn't really want to talk about that, so Peep would simply return to the Pasadena house, delete Homecoming off of his SoundCloud, and announce on Twitter that he would be leaving SchemaPosse, with Ghostman announcing that he was leaving as well only a couple minutes later. So just like that, the SchemaPosse was basically done, or at least that's what you would have believed if you listened to Adam 22, because he would announce that the collective was over, although there was still like 20 members at that point, but for Peep, he was done. But it wasn't a full fallout by any means. I mean, him and Green weren't cool for a while after that, but he was still close friends with a lot of the members of the group, and he would continue to make music with all of his friends from the Pasadena house. And only a couple days after that interview ended up coming out on No Jumper, Peep would then get his iconic Crybaby tattoo, which was a lot bigger than his friends initially thought, and apparently he would only let his tattoo artist work on him if he was under the influence of drugs, so you can see that Peep was definitely slipping quite a bit at this point. However, despite that, the tattoo actually looked pretty good, and it was only a month after that he would finally get the chance to meet Young Bruh in person. And if you don't know who Young Bruh is, that's little Tracy, with the two of them immediately meeting up through NetArb and recording a track that very same day called White Tea. And after that, despite barely having a word to say to each other, Peep and Tracy would become inseparable. Even after Peep basically became homeless because Craig Zem was making it impossible for him to stay at the house, as they were sharing a room at the time, and Craig would basically throw Peep's stuff all over the place, piss on the walls, and basically be a complete dick to Peep anytime that he was on drugs, which was basically every day. He ended up dropping one more music video that was shot at the house for his track Gym Class, before him and Tracy then headed down to Skid Row to basically stay at anybody's house that they could. This was one of the darkest times in Little Peep's life, with him basically couch hopping from place to place to place. Everywhere he went, there was non-stop drugs, partying, other rappers, and people basically willing to take advantage of him in any way they could. And this is also around the time that Ski Mask the Slump God went to stay with them. If you don't know the story behind that, basically Ski Mask came to go see Tracy. They created a track together called New World Order. Ski's clothes then ended up getting stolen. Apparently it was Young Goth who did it, but Young Cortex said that it it was actually another neighbor on Skid Row. Either way though, Ski was not happy. He ended up taking Peep off the song and said a bunch of other stuff. If you want to know more about that situation, I've talked about it endlessly. You can check out my Many Beasts a Little Peep video, but for now we're going to be moving on. But despite all the issues in his personal life, he was finally able to put out his next mixtape going by the name of Crybaby, with the lead single off this project, 19, going on to become a huge hit. He ended up performing it at a local venue, which got the attention of a local A&R person from First Access Entertainment, who would immediately go and show it to the CEO, who would then get one of their managers to approach Little Peep and ask to set up shows for him in the future. They didn't put anything officially down on paper, and he hadn't signed a deal with them yet, but he definitely was working with them pretty heavily. But despite that massive opportunity, the rest of the Crybaby project was also really impressive. I mean, this is basically peak Little Peep. If it's not your favorite project from him, it's probably Hellboy, but it's between these two for his greatest project of all time. This project would include a feature from Little Tracy, Coldheart, and Wiccaphase, who were all members of Gothboy Clique at the time. On top of that, this project features many of his most iconic tracks like Little Jeep and the title track, Crybaby. And honestly, I think that song that he made with Wiccaphase is one of his best songs of all time. It's definitely top 5. So at this point, Peep was really starting to hit his peak, but unfortunately, the money just wasn't there. In the summer of 2016, he ended up dropping yet another collaboration project, this time with Laderick, called Teen Romance, which was then followed up by Gothboy Clique's first collective project, which was called Yeah It's True, although Peep wouldn't appear on the project, as at the time he wasn't a full-on member yet. However, not long after that, him and Little Tracy ended up dropping their collaboration project together called Castles, which of course was very iconic, including the track White Wine, which went on to become one of their biggest hits. They ended up dropping a music video for the track not long after that, and then the two of them would go on to do multiple different shows all over California, trying to make as much money as they could so they could get off the street and maybe get into a place. Unfortunately though, by the time that August rolled around, Peep couldn't take being homeless anymore. He felt like he was either going to have to go back to New York or he was going to have to buy his own place, but he definitely wasn't making enough money off of his music to do so. But First Access Entertainment was willing to bail him out of the situation by signing a deal with him where he would get a big advance, as well as him being able to perform at stadiums if he wanted to, or at least that's what they promised him. It never ended up happening. And Peep really didn't want to do it. He didn't want his music to be controlled by a label, but unfortunately he really needed the money at the time, so he signed the deal, and after that he was no longer an independent artist. He now had a label that he had to answer to that could make changes to his music, fuck up his sound, and even destroy his connections with other artists. However, that wouldn't happen for a couple more months after this point. At first, getting all of that money was definitely a bright spot in his life. He was finally able to rent a house, which he ended up nicknaming The Loft. He was finally able to get some more professional studio equipment. I mean, after all, trying to record music on Skid Row with 100 other people in the room definitely wasn't easy. And it was here that he ended up recording most of his next mixtape, which he called Hellboy. And once again, like I said, if you don't think that Crybaby is his best project of all time, you're definitely going to think that Hellboy is. This project ended up dropping in September 2016 and had features from people like Horsehead, Little Tracy, Curb Lagoop, who he most likely met through Little Tracy, and even Xavier Wolf, who was a massive artist at the time. And honestly, this project has way too many iconic songs to name, so I'm not even going to try. All you need to know is that it was a very good body of work from Little Peep and is still a fan favorite to this day. And after the release of Hellboy, he would finally become a full-on member of Gothboy Clique against his label's better wishes. They really didn't want him to get in with a bunch of other rappers, as they had only really signed him as a solo artist, although apparently they did want Tracy. They would offer him a deal as well, saying that he could be partners with Lil Peep and that they could blow both of them up, but Little Tracy didn't want any part of that and would turn them down, which would start to cause a little bit of friction between Tracy and Peep, because after all, Peep was the one who got the advance, he was the one who was renting out the house, Tracy was still technically homeless. Peep was nice enough to let Tracy stay there almost every night, but whenever Peep got too high and fell asleep, his manager would show up and kick Tracy out, which of course wasn't a very nice feeling when the two of you guys were homeless together, and now you're homeless alone. Despite that though, Tracy didn't seem to let this bother him all that much. He would ask Peep on a couple different occasions why he didn't try to fight back against his manager more, but for the most part, they were still on good terms. It was also this month that Peep got the chance to be an opener alongside Smoke Perp on Fat Nick's When the Lean Runs Out tour, a project that Peep actually appeared on the track Fuck You, I'm not going to say that word. With Nick first becoming aware of Peep through his track 19, which he apparently ended up hearing on the radio, and he liked it so much that he reached out to Peep through Instagram. And this tour went on from the end of September to the middle of December 2016, basically taking Peep throughout the rest of the year. Although he would make a quick stop stop in LA in October so he could shoot the music video for his track Girls featuring Horsehead. And it was at this video shoot that he actually ended up meeting his next girlfriend, going by the name of Tupor, who was a model in the area. Now this relationship was very toxic. There was a lot that went on between them, although I don't feel like going into too many of the details in this video. I mean, after all, at this point, Peep was a full-blown drug addict. Tupor was probably doing a lot of drugs as well, so what do you really expect? After the tour wrapped up in mid-December, Peep would then go back to New York to spend time with his family, unbeknownst to them that it would actually be the final Christmas they all shared together, as unfortunately Peep would end up passing away before the Christmas of 2017. And this is where Peep would remain until January of 2017. Now, with 2016 basically being the greatest era of Peep's entire career, 2017 was the year that he was finally going to break through into the mainstream. It seems like First Access Entertainment really had high hopes for him, and he was getting to work on his first official album released through them. I mean, Hellboy was also released through them, but he had mostly worked on that before he signed the deal. This was going to be a new era for Peep, a new sound, a new look, a new everything. However, early 2017 really wasn't all that different from late 2016. He was still living at the loft. He ended up going to Disney World with Tupor, which seemed to be a pretty nice trip for him, despite the fact that they were still pretty toxic. Him and Tracy were working on a follow-up to Castles, creatively named Castles 2, and they even ended up putting out a single together called Witchblades. And it was this track that really got Peep attention from the mainstream audience. He would start to get posted in magazines, there was articles written about him, although it was these very same articles that would kind of put him in a bad spot with Tracy. You see, articles were praising the hell out of Lil Peep, calling him the new king of the emo wave, and saying that he was really going to bring that genre back to prominence, while only really making one mention of Tracy. And the reason behind this is most likely because First Access Entertainment ended up reaching out to these websites and told them to write articles about Peep while telling them to leave Tracy mostly out of it, because after all, they were still salty that he wouldn't sign a deal with them. And it was at this point that Tracy was becoming very fed up with Peep. I mean, it was bad enough that he was getting kicked out all the time, but now he wasn't getting credit on his own songs when he was actually the one who inspired Lil Peep in the first place. Although to be perfectly fair, Tracy definitely did steal a lot from Black Cray as well, so he can't really be mad at Peep, but we'll get to that when we cover Tracy. For now, all you need to know is there was a lot of friction between them. Castles 2 would end up coming out, they ended up doing a couple more shows together, but it seems like Peep was really starting to get fed up with having so many people in his house at all times, doing drugs, asking him for money. Apparently there was a point in 2017 that he was paying rent for both Fishnark and Horsehead, and keep in mind Peep was only really making around $6,000 a month, which is definitely really good. I would love to make that, but not enough to cover two different people's rent as well as your own. So he was really starting to get pulled in all directions, and he was also starting to feel used. I mean, after all, he wanted to be part of Gothboy Clique for years. He had looked up to Thrax House, he had looked up to Tracy, and now he was best friends with Tracy. He was finally around people who really understood him. But despite that, they were still doing what basically everybody else had done to him throughout his entire career. They were doping him up, they were taking his money, and at this point, Peep's manager was really getting on his ass to get away from them. However, by March of 2017, the group still seemed to be pretty healthy, with them all appearing on Ham on Everything to do an interview. In April, the entire group would go to the opening of the No Jumper store, where Peep would then shoot a vlog with Lena the Plug, not that type of vlog, get your head out of the gutter, and Tracy would end up shooting a music video for his track This Year, which included people like Big Head and Lil Peep. They also apparently ended up doing a No Jumper interview around this time, but unfortunately the audio was destroyed, so we don't know what they talked about, and nobody's been able to transcribe it even to this day. And that's very unfortunate, because this No Jumper interview was really the last hurrah of Little Tracy and Lil Peep being together as friends, because only a month later Peep ended up going on his first ever headlining tour all across America, with one show in Russia before it really kicked off, as after all, in Russia, emo rap is very popular, and he had a massive fan base over there. But for one reason or another, Little Tracy didn't end up going with them, and once Peep ended up getting on stage and performing Witchblades, he couldn't take it anymore. In his mind, Peep had basically used them, taken his style, taken his music, and now he was overseas performing the song that the two of them made together, not giving him credit, not giving him any money, and he just decided to cut the cord. Although publicly, nobody really knew that they were falling out behind the scenes until later that summer when Tracy ended up tweeting out about it, but things were definitely not good. So Peep was now on a tour all over America where he wasn't sleeping very well, going city to city, doing different drugs, and his best friend and him had now fallen out. On top of that, he was also sleeping in a very small van, and many of these venues were definitely not stadiums, and in fact were nothing more than a warehouse, which he was already performing in a year ago before he ever ended up signing a deal. So things were definitely getting very stressful for Peep. And once he got home, things weren't any better, as once again his entire house was completely full with SoundCloud rappers getting high, sleeping in his bed, and basically giving him no time to unwind and be by himself. So in a desperate move, he decided to reach out to his management and ask them if there was a way that he could leave California for a while and go somewhere to maybe get sober or at least get off some of the harder drugs that he was doing. And of course his label was completely thrilled, because after all, they didn't want him to be around Goth Boy Clique, they wanted him off drugs, so they immediately booked him a flight to Europe where he would then stay in London alongside Bexy as well as Young Goth, because he basically took Young Goth with him everywhere he went. And that's where he ended up staying for the following months. And this is where he really started to put in a lot of work on his project, Come Over When You're Sober Part 1. He ended up releasing a music video for his track Ben's Truck, which ended up picking a lot of steam on the internet. It never hit the Billboard Hot 100 or anything, but people were definitely starting to take notice of Lil Peep. It was also around this time that his relationship with Too Poor fell apart, as she actually ended up cheating on him before then going on to date Kill Station immediately after they broke up. Pretty dirty move, but well, I don't think Peep really cared all that much, as after all, he was starting to get massive opportunities like modeling in Paris, releasing music videos for his album including Bright Side, which he ended up shooting mostly in Russia. He tried to make the XXL freshman list for 2017, although unfortunately he didn't get enough votes and he wouldn't make the list. However, he would get the chance to perform at Rolling Loud to a mostly dead crowd. It seems like a lot of the mainstream audience at the time really didn't understand Peep, which is super unfortunate because I think nowadays people would love to see him at Rolling Loud, but the people who were there were not fucking with it. It was also around this time that he ended up coming out as bisexual, which caught the attention of I Love McConan, another gay rapper who really appreciated Peep coming out of the closet in such a public way, with the two of them linking up to create a project called Diamonds, which was meant to be a complete change of pace from Peep's normal stuff. At this point, he was going to be completely moving away from emo rap, the drugged out bars, talking about switchblades and cocaine, and instead he was going to make a pop album with McConan, which if it had came out, I'm really interested to see how the mainstream audience would have taken it as well as his fan base, because after all, at the time they liked him for his underground music. They already felt like he was starting to go a little bit too pop, so him going fully pop would definitely make them upset. But unfortunately, he never ended up finishing the project during the time that he was alive. In August of that year, Peep would go on to shoot the music video for the final single off of Come Over When You're Sober called Awful Things, which had a feature from Tracy, although you would think he wouldn't show up for the music video shoot, right? Well, surprisingly, somehow Peep was able to convince Tracy to show up, even though they definitely weren't on good terms at the time. Apparently, Tracy thought that it would be a good opportunity to get his name out there, but at the shoot, he was a complete piece of shit, as after all, he was high out of his mind. He hadn't slept for like 3 days at this point, and he would immediately ask for a bottle of Jameson, or he would refuse to perform in the video at all. And because of that, he really barely appeared in the video, and after he ended up sobering up a couple days later and seeing that it came out, he really wasn't a fan of it. But either way, this would become the biggest hit that Peep and Tracy ever had together. Although, to be honest with you, I kind of agree with Tracy. I think this song is kind of ass, but either way, it was a hit, and not long after that, Come Over When You're Sober Part 1 would finally release that August to kind of mixed reception, with some people saying that it was still the classic Lil Peep that they fell in love with, but others saying that it was a little bit too heavy on the autotune. Also, Anthony Fantano hated it, but I mean, who really cares about his opinion, right? Soon after that, in September, he would make headlines once again as he was spotted alongside Bella Thorne. I'm not really sure if this relationship was real or if he was only doing it to get publicity, as after all, many people thought that he was actually dating I Love McConan at the time. But either way, this relationship seemed to be pretty short-lived. On top of that, one of his longest running relationships ever would come to an end after Young Goth ended up showing up at his house with a seemingly underage girl, which completely horrified Peep. He would immediately slam the door in his face and tell him to go away because it would hurt his image to have young girls like that around, which is a horrific story if it's actually true, but when it comes to Young Goth, it probably is. After that, he would once again return to London for a short time before finally setting off on his final tour, the Come Over When You're Sober tour, which would become a complete disaster. Now, initially this tour was really only supposed to be Peep and Bexy. Bexy was going to be the opener, and then of course Peep would be the headliner. But apparently Peep would start to feel kind of bad that he had plans to leave Goth Boy Clique, so he would instead decide to invite Tracy to be an opener, which he of course turned down, also going on a No Jumper interview in October to talk even more shit on Peep. So with that no longer on the table, he instead decided to take a couple members of Goth Boy Clique, including Horsehead and Macnin, as one final send-off for them, giving them a little bit of exposure before he left the group once and for all. Now right off the bat, there was a couple red flags as well as green flags when it came to this tour. First of all, Peep had completely fallen out with his longtime manager, meaning there'd be a new manager for this tour, although she was seeming to do a pretty good job getting their old shitty van sold off and instead giving them a real tour bus. However, that was really the only good thing that she did for them, because as soon as they took off for the first show, she would immediately start supplying them with multiple different types of drugs, with her and Peep apparently even sleeping together at a couple different stops. And then after they ended up going to Canada for a show, she wasn't able to come back over the border, meaning that they were all on their own for a couple days. On top of that, Bexy had never really done drugs before, and he was now dabbling with them for the first time. Also, Macna was a addict at the time, so that definitely wasn't good. Peep ended up going out at one of the shows so high out of his mind that he couldn't even perform, and honestly, the tour probably should have been cancelled after that, but for some unknown reason, they would continue the tour with Peep becoming more and more tired, not sleeping for days at a time, and starting to do harder and harder drugs. At this point, he was doing ketamine almost every day. I mean, everybody on the bus was high on something, but Peep would basically spend all day sitting at the back of the bus just snorting lines of ketamine. Apparently, Tracy actually wanted to go see Peep on one of the tour stops in October, but the management team wouldn't let him, and if they had of, things could have been different, but honestly, things could have also got worse as they weren't really on good terms at the time. And to make matters even worse, by November, on Peep's 21st birthday, Fat Nick actually ended up giving him 50 Oxycontin and 100 Xanax, which they ended up taking in only 15 days time. And things had gotten so bad to the point that with only 3 shows left on the tour, they were actually thinking of canceling the entire thing, with the tour manager trying to cancel the El Paso show, telling them that Peep was too sick and there was no way that he was going to be able to do it. However, the venue wouldn't allow this, and Peep was forced to make a video where he's clearly completely inebriated out of his mind, telling his fans that he's good and that he's going to perform, but anybody with a rational mind should have known that there was no way that he should have went up on stage that night.
El Paso, I took 6 Xanax and I was lit. I'm good, I'm not sick. I'm gonna see y'all tonight.
And Peep's final 15 days on Earth were basically spent in a complete drugged out stupor, with him being incredibly angry, stressed out, talking to his mother about how he wasn't happy that he wasn't playing stadiums yet, telling the world that he no longer wanted to be little Peep and he would rather work at Taco Bell. He basically felt like all the pressures of Earth were coming down on him. Goth Boy Clique was using him, his management was using him, everybody was basically using him. And unfortunately, this all came to a head on November 15th of 2017 when Peep ended up coming out of the tour bus to meet up with a couple fans who would then supply him Xanax, hang out with him on the back of the bus before he then passed out. After that, the fans would then leave and Macna would come back on the bus, with him apparently being instructed to guard the door so nobody could go in. However, Macna had also brought some laced Oxycontin pills onto the bus, and one way or another, Peep ended up taking one of those, and by the end of the night, he unfortunately had passed away, although nobody would even notice for another 4 hours. Bexy and Macna were out shopping for clothes, Peep's tour manager was off doing an errand, and once they finally got back, they would poke him a couple times, but after he didn't wake up, they would simply go back to the front of the bus and continue to party. And things were so bad that Bexy actually ended up going to the back of the bus and recording a Snapchat video where he made a joke that Peep was working out back there, only for him to accidentally film his dead body.
Apparently Peep's at the back of the bus doing press-ups, sit-ups, working on his six-pack, his muscles. I'm gonna see for myself. Oh.
Bexy would claim that he heard Peep snoring, making him think that he was still alive, but what he didn't realize is that the noises that were coming out of him were actually death rattles, meaning that he had already passed away before he even shot the video, and then he would go back to the bus for another hour. And it was only after Peep's manager would return to the bus and try to wake him up that she realized that he was overdosing and decided to call the paramedics. They would immediately come, hit him with some Narcan, but unfortunately, he had already been dead for multiple hours at this point. But despite this horrible event, all of the fans were waiting outside outside of the venue for Peep to come up on stage and perform, and the paramedics were gonna have to take his body off of the bus without starting a riot, so Horsehead would go into the venue and try to perform to distract the fans, but unfortunately somebody would see Peep's body being rolled out of the bus and immediately a riot would break out. And well, after that, I think you know the rest of the story. Peep would pass away, the entire world would find out about it the very same day, and basically everything in the SoundCloud era would change. Immediately it was no longer cool to do drugs like Xanax, with many rappers coming out against the substance, claiming that if anybody would take it online, they'd be called out for it. Tracy would find out the next day, and of course he was devastated, Peep's mom was devastated, and the entire fan base of Little Peep was completely devastated. However, I'm not really going to talk too much about what happened after Peep passed away, because I plan for my next video to be a Little Tracy video, so I'm going to talk a lot more about that in that video. So for now, I'm just going to make my closing statement. And all I really have to say, as bad as things got for Peep between Gothboy Click and his management, I don't really blame anything for what happened to him. I mean, after all, he was an adult, he chose to do the drugs himself, but you can definitely understand the type of mindset that he was in late November. He was being pulled in so many different directions. First of all, he felt like he had finally met real friends with Gothboy Click, only for them to use him for money as well as drugs, with many of them even talking shit about him after he started to take off with his career. So even though he was doing good musically, he felt guilty about that. At the same time, he didn't know if he should believe his management company or not. He was basically going to have to leave all of his friends from the underground behind to become a mainstream rapper, but at the same time, his label wasn't really pulling it off that well. I mean, after all, he didn't make the XXL freshman list, his Rolling Loud performance didn't go all that well, it didn't really seem like they were pushing him as hard as they could have, which left Peep in a very weird place. I mean, he probably wanted to blow up and live out his dreams, but at the same time, he didn't want to lose all the friends that he had made throughout his entire career. I mean, after all, he only really got into making music to make friends and finally fit in. But unfortunately, when it comes to the underground rap scene or the music industry in general, if you want to make it to the top, you gotta be kind of a piece of shit, and Little Peep just wasn't. I mean, if you look at people like Playboi Carti, he was basically willing to use every person that he could, stabbing friends in the back, leaving people behind, and doing anything he could to make it to the top, but Peep wasn't willing to do that. And unfortunately, if you're not willing to play the game, the industry is going to pick you up, chew you up, and spit you out. And sadly, that's what happened to Little Peep in the worst way possible. And unfortunately, this isn't a one-off story, with things like this even happening nowadays. There's many kids who think that they can make it as a rapper, make it into the industry, make good music, make friends, and eventually become rich. But sadly, when you're a good person around a bunch of users, all they're going to do is use you until you're all used up. And I think that's what happened to Peep. Maybe it was his management, maybe it was his friends, or maybe he simply felt like he hadn't lived up to his full potential. But if he had lived a little bit longer, would he have made it there? Well, I'm not sure, and unfortunately, we'll never know. So with all that said, all I can say is rest in peace, Little Peep. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you made it to the end of this video, definitely subscribe to the channel, because this video is going to be like an hour long by the time I'm done with it. And if you liked it and you want to see more, make sure to let me know in the comments below, because I'm thinking after this I'm going to do Little Tracy, Black Cray, Young Lean, some of the underground's biggest artists. And if you want to stick around for that, then you definitely got to let me know in the comments below. And with that said,